Hi, I'm Gavin Nicholson, and if you've tuned into this video, you're probably interested in how we're structuring BSB250 business citizenship this semester. So I thought I'd go through why we structure it the way we do, why we have the assessment pieces like we do, and a little bit about using AI within the subject. The reason that I want to do that is so that you understand why that we have the tasks that we do in the order that we do and where we have them. And to show you that we've really thought about this. I know at times it can seem like we're looking for a fair bit of work during semester, and we are. And the reason is it improves your learning. Okay, so let's get into it. Why do we run the subject the way that we do? So the first thing I'd like to introduce to you is this idea about how we learn. Now, look, everyone might think they learn differently, and there probably are some subtle differences, but what works best for most people? It might not be what you think works best. So, for instance, this study here is what they call a meta-analysis, which is where they take together a whole lot of studies that have been done about different techniques for learning, combine them and see which are the most effective. So why don't we have a look at the table to see what the data say is the most effective way to learn. What you can see here is that we have different techniques that you might actually use when you're trying to learn, right? So you might try and explain something to yourself. You might write summaries of slides or notes. You might highlight a text, etc. So these are all different techniques that you can use in learning, some of the most well-known techniques that we know. Does it actually work? Okay. Well, what you can see is that most of them don't work terribly well, particularly things like rereading, coming up with mnemonics, highlighting. Things that you might naturally do to try and help you concentrate don't really help you learn that well. But two things do: practice testing and distributed practice. They're the two techniques that stand out. And it doesn't matter what kind of task or the way you test it. These work no matter how you're testing it, via an exam, via a quiz, via answering a problem, via writing an essay. These things work to help you learn. So what is practice testing? Well, it's any technique where you try and recall and apply what we've covered. Okay, so we're really about active recall. Second thing, distributed practice. You're much better trying to recover material several times than trying to do it all at once. If you cram your learning, you might get enough to pass, but you're not going to learn and remember that stuff. Okay, so these are the two techniques that we build into the way we approach the subject to improve your learning. Now, of course, you'd have to be living under a rock not to have noticed the impact of AI and specifically large language models on education and on what you can do. So we do have an approach to using AI in the subject, and essentially it's this: anything you submit to us should be your work, not the work of an LLM. So the personal code, the answers to problem sets, your reflection on a problem set, your comment on a reading, they need to be your work, not the work of large language models. There is a good, very, very good pedagogical reason for that. So let me get into it. Quite recently, a study came out about the use of AI and learning and your brain, particularly around essay writing. This paper was about by some people at the MIT lab. And this is taken directly from their abstract. And what does it tell us? Okay, what it tells us is that LLM users have weak brain activity. In fact, the kinds of brain activity that they have on my reading of the paper was essentially hand-eye coordination. If you use a large language model to write an essay, right? You just get it to write the essay for you. You develop eye-hand coordination, not thinking skills. Why? I reckon because you're copy and pasting, right? It's eye-hand coordination. Whereas in fact, if you didn't use any tool, just your brain, you actually have the strongest brain activity, okay? So there is something fundamentally different happening neurally in your learning if you don't use LLMs correctly. It's going to undermine your learning. But it's not only in your brain. We know that ownership of essays, whether you think they're yours. So this is going to affect things like your self-efficacy, whether you think you can do a problem, which is a key determinant of how well you do. That's going to be lower if you use large language models. Large language models users struggle to accurately quote their own work, so they can't recall. They're not actually learning it. Okay, so there's a number of problems if you rely on LLMs to do tasks for you. But here's the twist. What they did was they did a crossover study. So you could use an LLM and then do a second task where you use your brain. Or you could use your brain, so try and learn something, and then use an LLM to actually help you do a task later. If you go from brain to LLM, you actually get better learning and activation of higher order thinking. So it's not about using or not using LLMs. It's about using them in the right order. But those who use or rely on LLMs to do the task consistently underperform neurally, linguistically, behaviorally. So it inhibits learning when used incorrectly. Okay. So what does that actually mean for me, particularly around this subject? Well, what it means is that over-reliance on LLMs prior to learning the material actually inhibits that learning. So in this subject, any task we give you should not be entered into any LLM model or any kind of AI system that generates the answer for you. Any answer you give, the personal code, the comment in perusal, the problem sets should be yours, not that from an LLM. And we actively look for and try and detect the inappropriate use of AI. So for instance, last semester, I detected at least 100 cases in the assignment piece. That doesn't mean that I don't want you using LLMs, not that at all. You just need to use them appropriately. So you can use them to help you learn. And in fact, we have some experimental tools that we try and provide for you to help you to do these tasks. Okay, so it's not about using it or not using it. It's about using it appropriately. Number one thing for you to think about, you should not be getting it to generate your answers. Okay? Your answers should be your answers. You shouldn't be putting any of the tasks we give you into large language models. That way, we're trying to get your brain to think about it kind of the right way. Once you've acquired the skill, then large language models can really help you do things more effectively and more efficiently, that's for sure. But that's not our purpose here. Our purpose here is not to be efficient. Our purpose here is to learn. Right? There's a big difference. So we put all that together and we end up with this kind of framework about how to run a subject. What we're looking for is multiple exposures to the material, distributed practice, and active recall, using that material multiple times. So this is why we have a pattern to how we run the subject. Let's look at that pattern. So what you can see is we've divided tasks into whether they're on your own, asynchronous, or face-to-face synchronous, whether it's online or in person. First thing you've got to do is prepare for the week. That's your first exposure to the material, and we have the social reading platform Perusal. We grade that that becomes part of your portfolio, and the grading starts in weeks 5 and 6. Okay, so you've got a little while to get used to that program, but there's our first exposure, reading the notes. I'm also going to try and do some vodcasts this semester, so there could be some video too if you prefer material that way. Your second exposure comes through the lecture. Now, I don't lecture all of the material or all of the slides you're meant to have prepared. The aim here is actually to interact with you Socratively, right? So that it gets that more active recall occurring around the material. And that's your second exposure. Right? So you get some peer learning and you get some Socratic method occurring in the lecture. After the lecture, you should be preparing your tutorial. As you prepare for your tutorial, you're actually trying to apply the material. That's your third exposure, right? As you prepare problems. You go to the tutorial where you go through the problems with your peers, fourth exposure. Then you revisit or reflect on it, a fifth exposure. Okay, so we have some AI tools for you and other ways that you can do that. Finally, you do an application in a summative task, right? So either the personal code, assessment item 1, the problem set, assessment item 2 for the portfolio, or the exam, assessment item 3. So there's many ways you apply, right? But we're getting multiple exposures for distributed practice. And what we're doing in these areas is applying it, active recall. Okay, so it's important. That's how everything fits together. Now, if I was you, I'd be sitting there going, oh my God, it seems like a lot of work. Well, yes and no. I mean, a university subject is supposed to be 12 hours of work. That's how the accreditation body works. So how much work do we kind of expect in these? Well, here's an example of how that might look. What you can see is probably a couple of hours to prepare at most, right? 4 hours of going to the lecture, preparing for the tute, going to the tute, right? There's 3 hours in there, an hour of prep, so there's probably 4 hours there. Couple of hours working on your assessment piece, either the problem set or developing your code for assessment item 1. And so you can see it's probably 8 or 9 hours a week, about a day a week, yeah? Yes, full time. That's about the amount of work at a university level. Can you do it a little bit quicker? Yes, you can. Will some people take a bit longer? Yes, they will. But what you can see, the volume of tasks we're after is not out of line with the amount of time you should be putting aside for the subject. So what I'd also like to point out is that all of these activities are directly related to your assessment. So in the first 3 weeks in particular, what we do is specifically address issues directly relevant to your personal code. Okay, so you get an ability to prepare a like-minded thing. We also give you some tools to help you reflect and prepare for that actual piece. And then from weeks 5 on, all of the problems that we're doing in the tutorials are very similar to the kind of things you'll have to do on the exam. So we're not asking you in any of this time to do anything that's extraneous. There's a period of time that you need to take the material on board. It's reading, watching a bit of video, and from there on it becomes application to the kinds of problems that are the assessment tasks. And this is an example of how that works for, say, your problem set, right? What we're doing in class is directly relevant to each problem set you're going to submit as part of your portfolio. And those problems are directly related to what's going to be on the exam. They're the exact same kind of problems you're going to get on the exam. And we also have tried to structure the subject so that you can kind of concentrate on one kind of task at a time. So let's have a look at the timing of how things work in the semester. In this table, you can get a sense of when things are due in terms of the semester week and when the lectures and tutorials take place. So you can see at the top we have each month and the date of the Monday of that week and the week, so week 1, and you'll know that our lectures are on Wednesdays, and then depending upon your tutorial, it's either on a Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday. So the days you can see are down on this side of the figure. In week 4, the personal code is due in week 6 on the Saturday of week 6, portfolio 1, and then every 2 weeks the portfolio is due on the Saturday. So how do things work? Well, at the beginning of the week, in this period, you can do your reading, look at any vodcasts, get some prep in for the week. We have the lecture, which is where we reinforce that work, and then the tutorial. So you can prepare for the tutorial. And then after the tutorial, you can reflect on it. Now, that reflection in the first weeks goes directly into contributing to your personal code assessment item 1. From weeks 4 on, the same thing applies. We do the prep work before the lectures. Then we do the tutorial where we actually practice a problem. And then after you've practiced the problem, you have a think about your answer, the answer that you prepared for the tutorial, and you update or correct that answer. Then that becomes the submission for the portfolio, as well as this reading. And that happens every 2 weeks. So every 2 weeks, we exposure, prepare, exposure at the lecture, exposure at the tutorial, then a reflection to help us prep. Of course, the end exam, which is due sometime in the final period here, the final exam period here, is made up of the kinds of problems that we do in each tutorial. So these portfolio submissions are integrally linked to the end exam. A final thing to look at, a final thing to remember is that in terms of the portfolio, not every portfolio submission counts, only the best 6. So it's worth 30%. That means 5% for each of your best 6. So that means you could miss an entire submission and still get 100%, or you might miss 2 readings or 2 problem sets. Okay. And then the best 6 marks that you have out of those 8 possible components is what counts for the portfolio. Okay, so that seems like a lot of work. Look, it can be. What do you do if you don't have 12 hours a week? I think the first thing you've got to ask yourself is what kind of workload you're taking on as a whole, right? I mean, if you're studying full-time and working full-time, you're not going to have much time for anything else. But that's a personal decision you'll make. But if you don't see yourself setting aside, 8 hours or so minimum for this subject, I'd start saying, hey, is this the subject I should be doing this semester? Second thing, I would suggest that you do all the assessments, not just the ones that you have to do, not just doing the bare minimum 6 out of 8. Do them all because they will all help you get ready for the end exam. So doing the stuff, practicing what we're doing in terms of content prepares you for the exam, which is when you're going to have to use it. So you get a double benefit out of it. Even if you do it one week when you're not really prepared enough, what you'll find is that you can just drop that mark anyway. So there's not a lot of downside in doing all the assessment. So I'd really suggest you do all the assessment. I'd also suggest that each week you've got to go through the materials. So, read the slides at a minimum, preferably the reading. Have a look at the vodcasts, right? Make sure you attend a tutorial as the next step that you need to do, right? Because the tutorial is where we do the application. Then the next thing I'd make sure I do is prepare for the tutorial. You'll get a lot more out of the tutorial if you prepare for it. Not only in terms of helping you do the assessment, like the portfolio, but also in terms of your actual learning, because you get another exposure. And that means, of course, that kind of the lecture is the last thing I'd suggest. So almost the first thing that you drop, because you can get the vodcast, you can do the reading to get the content. I think there's added value because I tend not to lecture, but talk about the key concepts, and it's another exposure. But there are other ways to get that content. So do something to make sure you cover the content. At the bare minimum, look at the slides, but preferably do the readings in perusal, right? Second thing, make sure you go to a tutorial as your second priority. That's where you'll see application of the material to know what we're after. Third thing, prepare for the tutorial before you go to it, right? If you've got enough time, just spend half an hour getting ready for that tute. You'll get a lot more out of it if you have a go at a problem before you actually turn up to the tutorial. And then finally, attend the lectures. So that's a kind of order of priority for those who have limited time. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea about how things fit together in the subject, what our expectations are, how we see AI being used, how the assessment kinds of fits together in terms of pedagogical terms, and a prioritization that you might want to think about if you don't have all the time you need every week. Other than that, I look forward to seeing you in class.